cloud appeared on the horizon just after dawn, a brown smudge against the pale Arizona sky that caught the attention of Elder Samuel Morrison as he tended to his morning prayers. Through the window of the modest chapel, he watched as a weathered wagon approached the settlement, its wheels creaking rhythmically against the hard-packed earth. The year was 1870, and strangers were both a blessing and a concern in this remote Mormon community, where every soul was known and accounted for. The wagon carried a family of 5, a stern-faced patriarch with graying temples, his wife wrapped in dark wool despite the desert heat, and 3 adult children whose eyes held the same distant quality as their parents. They called themselves the Benders, and they spoke with the measured cadence of people accustomed to keeping their words carefully chosen. "We seek a place to serve the Lord and our fellow man," the father, Johann Bender, explained to Elder Morrison and the small gathering of community leaders who had assembled to greet the newcomers. His accent carried traces of German heritage, common enough among the faithful who had traveled from distant lands to build Zion in the wilderness. The eldest son, John Jr., stood slightly apart from his family, his pale blue eyes scanning the settlement with an intensity that made some of the women uncomfortable. Beside him, his brother William maintained a more pleasant demeanor, offering genuine smiles to the children who peeked out from behind their mother's skirts. The daughter, Kate, possessed a sharp intelligence that showed in her quick responses to questions about their journey, while the mother, Almira, remained largely silent, her hands folded perpetually in prayer position. Elder Morrison found himself drawn to the family's apparent devotion. They carried well-worn scriptures, spoke knowledgeably of doctrine, and expressed a sincere desire to contribute to the community's welfare. When Johann mentioned their experience operating a roadside inn in their previous settlement, the elder's interest was immediately piqued. "The Lord provides," Morrison murmured, stroking his beard thoughtfully. "We've long needed proper accommodation for travelers passing through to California. The stagecoach route brings many souls seeking rest and sustenance." The community had indeed struggled with this very issue. Travelers often arrived exhausted and hungry, but the settlement lacked adequate facilities to house them properly. Most families took in guests when possible, but the arrangement strained resources and disrupted household routines. A dedicated inn would solve multiple problems while providing the Benders with a means of supporting themselves. Within a week, the community had rallied to help the newcomers establish their business. The men worked together to construct a modest but sturdy building at the settlement's edge, positioned strategically where the main road curved toward the distant mountains. The structure featured a common room for dining, a kitchen area, and several small chambers for overnight guests. A hand-painted sign reading "Bender Inn, Clean Beds, Hot Meals" was mounted prominently above the entrance. The Bender family threw themselves into their work with admirable dedication. Almira proved to be an excellent cook, preparing hearty meals that satisfied even the most particular travelers. Kate demonstrated remarkable skill at managing accounts and corresponding with suppliers in distant towns. Johann maintained the building and grounds with meticulous care, while his sons handled the heavier work of caring for guests' horses and equipment. From the beginning, John Jr. and William divided their responsibilities in a way that seemed natural but would later prove significant. John Jr. typically remained close to the inn, greeting arriving guests and helping them settle in. His manner was formal but welcoming, and he possessed an uncanny ability to put even nervous travelers at ease. William, meanwhile, often rode out to meet incoming stagecoaches or wagon trains, offering to guide them to the inn and sometimes providing assistance with mechanical problems or directions. The arrangement worked well for everyone involved. Travelers appreciated having a reliable place to rest, The community benefited from the increased commerce and positive reputation among passing merchants, and the Benders appeared to be thriving in their new home. Elder Morrison frequently commented on how the Lord had blessed them all through the family's arrival. As autumn settled over the territory, the inn had become an established part of the community's rhythm. The sound of arriving wagons, the smell of Almira's cooking, and the sight of Kate sweeping the front porch each morning became familiar elements of daily life. Children often gathered to watch the comings and goings of exotic travelers from distant places, and their parents felt grateful to have such respectable neighbors. Yet even in those early months, there were subtle signs that not all was as it appeared. Some of the more observant residents noticed that the Bender brothers often disappeared for hours at a time, claiming to be hunting or gathering supplies. Others remarked on the family's unusual eating habits. They seemed to consume far more meat than their modest income should have allowed, and they were often seen disposing of large quantities of bones and scraps. Mrs. Sarah Whitman, whose house stood closest to the inn, occasionally heard strange sounds at night, muffled conversations, the scraping of shovels, and sometimes what sounded like crying or pleading. When she mentioned these observations to her husband, he dismissed them as the normal sounds of a busy establishment. Travelers arrive at all hours, he reminded her, and the Benders work hard to maintain their property. The first winter passed peacefully, with the inn providing crucial shelter for several groups of travelers caught in unexpected storms. The Benders' reputation for hospitality grew, and word of their establishment spread along the trading routes. By spring, they were receiving regular recommendations from previous guests, and their business appeared to be flourishing. But prosperity brought increased scrutiny, and some community members began to notice discrepancies that troubled them. Certain travelers who had been expected to continue their journeys simply vanished without explanation. When concerned friends or family members inquired about missing persons, the Benders claimed no knowledge of their whereabouts, suggesting that such individuals had likely changed their plans or taken alternative routes. Elder Morrison initially dismissed these concerns as the natural result of frontier life's uncertainties. People did sometimes alter their travel plans, encounter difficulties, or simply lose touch with distant relatives. The wilderness held many dangers, from hostile natives to treacherous weather, and not every journey ended as planned. However, as the pattern continued and the number of missing persons grew, even the most trusting community members began to harbor doubts. The Benders maintained their facade of respectability, attending religious services regularly and participating in community activities with apparent sincerity. Yet an undercurrent of unease began to permeate the settlement, a feeling that something fundamental was amiss beneath the surface of their peaceful existence. The stage was set for revelations that would shatter the community's faith in their neighbors and force them to confront the possibility that evil could wear the mask of righteousness with terrifying effectiveness. The Bender Inn quickly established itself as more than just a place of lodging. It became a social hub where travelers shared news from distant territories and local residents gathered for special occasions. Kate Bender, with her quick wit and engaging personality, proved particularly adept at drawing stories from guests, learning about their backgrounds, destinations, and most importantly, their financial circumstances. The inn's common room featured rough-hewn tables and chairs, arranged around a large stone fireplace, where Almira maintained a perpetual pot of stew that filled the space with savory aromas. The walls displayed simple religious texts and landscape paintings that created an atmosphere of humble comfort. Guests often remarked on the family's attention to detail, fresh linens, clean floors, and meals that rivaled those found in much larger establishments. John Jr. had developed a particular talent for making travelers feel secure and welcome. His tall, lean frame and soft-spoken manner conveyed trustworthiness, while his knowledge of local conditions and routes proved invaluable to those unfamiliar with the territory. He would spend hours discussing travel plans with guests, offering advice about weather patterns, road conditions, and potential hazards. Many visitors later wrote in letters home about the helpful young man who had made their journey so much more pleasant. William, meanwhile, had cultivated relationships with stagecoach drivers and freight haulers throughout the region. His friendly demeanor and willingness to assist with mechanical problems or provide emergency supplies had earned him a reputation as someone who could be counted on in difficult situations. Drivers began specifically routing their passengers to the Bender Inn, knowing they would receive quality service and fair prices. The family's religious devotion appeared genuine and deep. They attended every service at the community chapel, participated in prayer meetings, and often hosted informal Bible study sessions at the inn. Johann would lead discussions on scripture with a scholarly approach that impressed even Elder Morrison, while Almira's quiet piety served as an example to other women in the settlement. Their integration into the community's spiritual life seemed complete and sincere. Yet beneath this veneer of respectability, the Bender brothers had begun to implement a carefully planned system of predation that would eventually claim numerous victims. Their method was sophisticated in its simplicity, relying on the trust and vulnerability of travelers far from home and help. The process typically began when William encountered potential victims during his travels around the territory. He would identify individuals or small groups who appeared to be carrying significant wealth, traveling alone or with minimal protection, and following routes that would bring them through the settlement. His friendly conversations served a dual purpose, gathering intelligence about their plans and resources while establishing himself as a helpful local contact. When promising targets approached the inn, John Jr. would take over the operation. His role was to assess the guests more thoroughly, confirming their financial status and determining whether they posed any significant risk. He became expert at reading people, identifying those who would be missed quickly versus those whose disappearance might go unnoticed for weeks or months. The brothers had identified several key factors that made travelers ideal victims: those carrying large amounts of cash or valuable goods, individuals with no fixed schedule or expected arrival time at their destination, people traveling under assumed names or with unclear backgrounds, and most importantly, those who had no close companions who knew their exact whereabouts. For guests who met these criteria, the Benders would implement their deadly plan with chilling efficiency. The family had modified the inn's layout to facilitate their crimes, creating hidden spaces and escape routes that allowed them to act without detection. The common room's seating arrangement had been carefully designed to position certain guests with their backs to a particular wall, behind which John Jr. could position himself with a heavy hammer. The method was brutally simple but effective. While the victim sat enjoying Almira's cooking and engaging in pleasant conversation with Kate, John Jr. would strike from behind with devastating force. The thick log walls muffled any sounds, and the family's practiced routine ensured that evidence was quickly eliminated. Bodies were disposed of in pre-dug graves scattered throughout the surrounding wilderness, while personal belongings were either destroyed or sold in distant markets where they couldn't be traced. The psychological aspect of their crimes was perhaps even more disturbing than the physical violence. The Benders had perfected the art of making their victims feel completely safe and welcome in their final moments. Kate's engaging conversation, Almira's maternal care, and the warm, home-like atmosphere of the inn created a sense of security that made the sudden violence even more shocking and effective. Between murders, the family maintained their facade with remarkable consistency. They continued to provide excellent service to legitimate guests, participate in community activities, and present themselves as model citizens. Their ability to compartmentalize their criminal activities while maintaining normal social relationships demonstrated a level of psychological sophistication that would have impressed criminal psychologists had such professionals existed at the time. The disposal of evidence required careful planning and execution. The brothers had identified numerous remote locations throughout the surrounding desert where bodies could be buried without detection. They varied their burial sites to avoid creating patterns that might be discovered, and they took care to remove all traces of their victims' presence at the inn. Personal effects were sorted carefully, valuable items were retained for later sale, while identifying documents and personal mementos were destroyed completely. The financial rewards of their crimes allowed the family to maintain their inn at a higher standard than their legitimate income would have supported. They were able to purchase quality supplies, maintain their building in excellent condition, and even make charitable contributions to the community that enhanced their reputation for generosity and civic responsibility. As their operation continued, the brothers became increasingly confident in their methods and began targeting victims more frequently. What had started as opportunistic crimes evolved into a systematic predatory enterprise that generated substantial income while satisfying their apparent psychological need for violence and control. The community remained largely unaware of the horror unfolding in their midst. The Benders' careful victim selection meant that disappearances were often attributed to the normal hazards of frontier travel, while their continued participation in community life provided powerful evidence of their innocence. Even when concerns were raised about missing travelers, the family's reputation for honesty and their apparent cooperation with inquiries deflected suspicion. However, their success would ultimately prove to be their downfall, as the accumulating evidence of their crimes would eventually become impossible to ignore or explain away. As the second year of the Bender Inn's operation began, subtle changes in the community's atmosphere became increasingly difficult to ignore. Mrs. Sarah Whitman found herself lying awake more frequently, disturbed by sounds that seemed to emanate from the direction of the inn during the darkest hours of night. The scraping of shovels against hard earth, muffled voices engaged in urgent conversation, and occasionally what sounded disturbingly like human cries of distress. Her husband, Thomas, initially dismissed her concerns as the product of an overactive imagination. "The desert plays tricks on the mind," he would remind her, settling back into sleep with the confidence of someone whose faith provided ready explanations for life's mysteries. But even Thomas began to notice peculiarities that challenged his willingness to ignore the growing evidence of something amiss. The first concrete sign of trouble came when merchant Samuel Harrison failed to arrive in Tucson as scheduled. Harrison had been a regular traveler through the settlement for over 3 years, known for his punctuality and reliable business practices. His brother in Tucson sent inquiries when Harrison's expected shipment of goods never materialized, and the investigation revealed that he had last been seen approaching the Bender Inn. When Elder Morrison approached the family about Harrison's disappearance, their response was both helpful and troubling. Johann expressed genuine concern for the missing merchant, while Kate provided detailed information about Harrison's stay at the inn. According to her account, he had seemed agitated and mentioned receiving disturbing news about Indian activity along his planned route. She claimed he had decided to take a more circuitous path to avoid potential conflict, which would explain both his delay and his failure to follow his usual schedule. The explanation was plausible enough to satisfy most inquiries, but it established a pattern that would be repeated with increasing frequency. Travelers would arrive at the inn, spend a night or two as paying guests, and then vanish without completing their journeys. In each case, the Benders provided reasonable explanations for the disappearances: route changes, family emergencies, business opportunities that required sudden detours. Dr. William York, a respected physician traveling to establish a practice in California, became the next prominent victim to disappear under mysterious circumstances. Unlike previous cases, Dr. York's disappearance generated significant attention because of his professional standing and the detailed travel plans he had shared with colleagues. His brother, a Kansas state senator, initiated a formal investigation that brought outside scrutiny to the settlement for the first time. The investigation revealed disturbing patterns that local residents had been reluctant to acknowledge. Over the past 18 months, at least 12 travelers had disappeared after staying at or near the Bender Inn. While each individual case could be explained by the hazards of frontier travel, the collective pattern suggested something more sinister than coincidence. John Jr. and William's hunting expeditions also began to attract attention from community members who possessed knowledge of local wildlife and hunting practices. The brothers claimed to be pursuing deer and other game animals, but their frequent absences and the large quantities of meat they regularly brought home seemed inconsistent with the sparse wildlife population in the immediate area. Moreover, experienced hunters in the community noted that the Benders never shared details about their hunting locations or techniques, despite the frontier tradition of exchanging such information freely. The family's eating habits provided another source of growing concern. Neighbors observed that the Benders consumed unusually large quantities of meat, often preparing meals that seemed far beyond their apparent means. When asked about their sources, they claimed to have arrangements with distant ranchers and traders, but no one in the community could verify these business relationships. Mrs. Rebecca Martinez, whose husband operated the settlement's general store, began keeping informal records of the Benders' purchases and noticed several troubling patterns. They regularly bought large quantities of salt, lime, and other preservatives typically used for processing meat. They also purchased unusual amounts of soap, lye, and cleaning supplies, far more than would be needed for normal inn operations. Most disturbing, they frequently bought shovels, picks, and other digging implements, claiming they were expanding their property or making improvements to their facilities. The psychological toll on the community began to manifest in various ways. Children who had once played freely around the inn now seemed reluctant to venture near the property. Parents found themselves making excuses to avoid social gatherings at the establishment, despite the family's continued hospitality and apparent warmth. Even the most faithful community members began to experience doubts that challenged their fundamental beliefs about human nature and divine protection. Elder Morrison found himself in an increasingly difficult position as spiritual leader of the community. His role required him to provide guidance and reassurance to his flock, but the accumulating evidence of wrongdoing challenged his ability to maintain faith in the Benders' innocence. The elder began spending more time in private prayer, seeking divine guidance about how to address the growing crisis of confidence in the community. The arrival of Colonel Alexander York, Dr. York's brother, and a man with considerable political influence, marked a turning point in the investigation. Unlike local authorities who were inclined to accept the Benders' explanations, Colonel York brought resources and determination that would prove difficult to deflect. He established a temporary headquarters in the settlement and began conducting systematic interviews with every resident who had interacted with the missing physician. Colonel York's investigation methodology was thorough and professional, reflecting his military background and political experience. He created detailed timelines of his brother's journey, mapped the locations where Dr. York had been seen, and identified inconsistencies in the various accounts of his disappearance. Most importantly, he refused to accept vague explanations or dismiss concerns as frontier paranoia. The colonel's presence in the community created a new dynamic that the Benders found increasingly difficult to manage. Their usual tactics of deflection and misdirection proved less effective against someone with investigative experience and the authority to demand answers. For the first time since their arrival, the family appeared genuinely concerned about outside scrutiny. As Colonel York's investigation progressed, he began to uncover evidence that previous disappearances were connected in ways that local authorities had failed to recognize. His systematic approach revealed patterns in the timing, circumstances, and characteristics of the missing persons that pointed toward deliberate predation rather than random misfortune. The community found itself caught between loyalty to neighbors who had served them well and growing evidence that those same neighbors might be responsible for horrific crimes. The psychological strain of this conflict began to manifest in various ways. Decreased attendance at community gatherings, increased security measures around individual homes, and a general atmosphere of suspicion that poisoned previously trusting relationships. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would force the community to face the full horror of what had been occurring in their midst. And the Bender family began to realize that their carefully constructed facade was finally beginning to crumble under sustained scrutiny. Colonel York's methodical investigation began to yield disturbing results that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence or frontier misfortune. His systematic approach to gathering evidence included detailed interviews with every community member, careful examination of the inn's premises, and coordination with law enforcement officials in neighboring territories. The picture that emerged painted the Bender family in an increasingly sinister light. The colonel's military training had taught him to recognize patterns and inconsistencies that civilian investigators might overlook. He noticed that the Benders' explanations for various disappearances contained subtle contradictions when compared across multiple interviews. Kate's detailed memory of guests' conversations seemed suspiciously comprehensive, while John Jr.'s accounts of his interactions with travelers contained timing discrepancies that suggested deliberate deception. Most significantly, Colonel York discovered that several of the missing travelers had been carrying substantial amounts of cash or valuable goods, information that the Benders claimed not to have known. However, his investigation revealed that the family had demonstrated unusually detailed knowledge of their guests' financial circumstances in conversations with other community members. This suggested a level of surveillance and assessment that went far beyond normal hospitality. The colonel also uncovered evidence that the Benders had been selling goods in distant markets that matched descriptions of items belonging to missing travelers. A saddlemaker in Tucson confirmed that he had purchased a distinctive hand-tooled saddle from William Bender that matched one owned by the missing merchant Samuel Harrison. When confronted with this evidence, William claimed to have found the saddle abandoned along a remote trail, but his explanation failed to account for how he had known its value or where to sell it. Dr. Martinez, the settlement's physician, provided crucial testimony about the family's unusual medical needs. Over the past year, the Benders had requested treatment for injuries that seemed inconsistent with their claimed activities. John Jr. had sought care for deep cuts on his hands that he attributed to hunting accidents, but the wounds patterns suggested they had been caused by struggling with human victims rather than wild animals. William had required treatment for bite marks that he claimed came from a horse, but Dr. Martinez's examination suggested they were human in origin. The community's children, often overlooked as witnesses, provided some of the most damning evidence against the family. Several youngsters reported seeing the Bender brothers digging in remote areas during nighttime hours, carrying heavy bundles that appeared to contain human remains. While adults had initially dismissed these accounts as childhood fantasies, Colonel York recognized their potential significance and conducted careful interviews that revealed consistent details across multiple witnesses. Mrs. Whitman finally found the courage to share her detailed observations about the strange sounds and activities she had witnessed from her neighboring property. Her testimony included specific dates and times that correlated with the disappearances of known victims, providing a timeline that supported the theory of systematic murder. Her husband, initially reluctant to support her claims, eventually confirmed that he too had noticed unusual activities, but had chosen to ignore them out of respect for their neighbor's privacy. The psychological pressure on the Bender family became evident as Colonel York's investigation intensified. Kate, previously known for her quick wit and engaging personality, became increasingly withdrawn and defensive. Her responses to questions became shorter and less detailed, and she began avoiding social interactions that had previously been central to her role in the community. John Jr. developed nervous habits, constantly checking his surroundings, startling at unexpected sounds, and displaying an agitation that contrasted sharply with his former calm demeanor. Johann and Almira attempted to maintain their facade of religious devotion, but even their participation in community worship began to seem forced and artificial. Elder Morrison noted that their prayers had become more fervent and desperate, as if they were seeking divine intervention to escape their increasingly precarious situation. Their biblical discussions, once scholarly and engaging, now focused obsessively on themes of judgment, punishment, and redemption. The family's business operations also began to show signs of strain. They started refusing certain guests without clear explanations, became more selective about whom they would accommodate, and displayed a nervousness around travelers that contrasted with their previous welcoming attitude. Some potential guests reported feeling unwelcome or sensing an atmosphere of tension that made them choose alternative accommodations. Colonel York's investigation reached a critical point when he obtained permission to conduct a thorough search of the inn's premises. The search revealed evidence that the family had attempted to conceal: bloodstains on floorboards that had been recently replaced, unusual modifications to the building's structure that could facilitate the disposal of bodies, and hidden compartments containing personal effects that belonged to missing travelers. Most damning was the discovery of a concealed trapdoor in the common room floor that led to a small cellar space. The cellar contained evidence of recent use: disturbed earth, blood stains, and fragments of clothing that matched descriptions of items worn by missing persons. The space's design and location confirmed suspicions that victims had been murdered while seated at the inn's dining table, with their bodies disposed of through the hidden chamber. The community's reaction to these revelations was one of shock, horror, and profound betrayal. Residents who had welcomed the Benders into their homes, shared meals with them, and trusted them with their children, struggled to reconcile the evidence of their crimes with their memories of apparent kindness and devotion. The psychological impact of discovering that such evil had existed undetected in their midst challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and divine protection. Elder Morrison faced a crisis of faith as he grappled with the implications of the Benders' deception. His role as spiritual leader required him to provide guidance and comfort to his traumatized community, but he found himself questioning how such evil could have flourished under his pastoral care. The elder's sermons during this period reflected his struggle to understand how appearances could be so thoroughly deceiving and how faith could coexist with such profound evil. As the evidence mounted and the community's suspicions crystallized into certainty, the Bender family realized that their position had become untenable. Their carefully constructed facade had finally crumbled under sustained scrutiny, and they faced the prospect of arrest, trial, and almost certain execution for their crimes. The family began making preparations for what they hoped would be a successful escape from justice. The stage was set for a final confrontation that would determine whether the Benders would face accountability for their crimes or succeed in evading the consequences of their horrific actions. The community, meanwhile, prepared to confront the full extent of the horror that had been perpetrated in their midst and to begin the difficult process of healing from the trauma of betrayal and deception. The morning of March 15th, 1871, dawned with an unusual stillness that seemed to press down upon the settlement like a physical weight. Mrs. Whitman, whose sleep had been increasingly troubled by her proximity to the Bender Inn, noticed immediately that the familiar sounds of morning activity from the neighboring property were absent. No smoke rose from the chimney, no voices carried across the desert air, and the usual bustle of inn operations had been replaced by an ominous silence. Colonel York had planned to return to the inn that morning with a formal warrant and additional investigators from the territorial capital. His systematic gathering of evidence had reached the point where he felt confident in making arrests, and he had spent the previous evening finalizing arrangements with local law enforcement officials. However, when his party arrived at the inn shortly after sunrise, they discovered that their quarry had vanished during the night. The Bender family's escape had been planned with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized their criminal operations. They had departed under cover of darkness, taking only essential supplies and leaving behind most of their possessions to avoid arousing suspicion. Their wagon tracks led west toward California, but the family had clearly taken steps to obscure their trail and confuse potential pursuers. Inside the abandoned inn, Colonel York's search team made discoveries that confirmed their worst suspicions about the family's activities. The building had been hastily cleaned, but evidence of the Benders' crimes remained visible to trained investigators. Bloodstains that had soaked deep into wooden surfaces, fragments of victims' clothing hidden in crevices, and personal effects that belonged to missing travelers provided irrefutable proof of systematic murder. The most horrifying discovery came when the search team began excavating the property's grounds. Using information provided by local children who had witnessed the brothers' nighttime digging activities, investigators identified several burial sites scattered around the inn's perimeter. The first grave they opened contained the remains of Dr. William York, whose distinctive pocket watch and medical instruments confirmed his identity. As the excavation continued, the full scope of the Benders' crimes became apparent. 11 bodies were eventually recovered from graves around the inn, representing victims spanning nearly 2 years of operation. The condition of the remains suggested that the murders had been committed with brutal efficiency, typically involving blunt force trauma to the head, followed by throat cutting to ensure death. The forensic evidence also supported the community's most disturbing suspicions about cannibalism. Several of the recovered bodies showed signs of systematic butchering that went beyond simple disposal of evidence. Bones had been cracked to extract marrow, organs had been removed with surgical precision, and the pattern of cuts suggested that human flesh had been harvested for consumption. The implications of this discovery sent shockwaves through the community and the broader territory. Dr. Martinez, despite his medical training and professional composure, found himself deeply shaken by the examination of the remains. His report documented evidence of torture and prolonged suffering that suggested the Benders had taken sadistic pleasure in their victims' final moments. Some bodies showed signs of restraint marks, indicating that victims had been held captive before being killed, while others displayed injuries consistent with systematic abuse. The community's reaction to these revelations was one of profound trauma and disbelief. Residents who had shared meals with the Bender family accepted their hospitality and trusted them with their children, struggled to process the reality that they had been living alongside cannibalistic murderers. Many experienced symptoms that would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress, insomnia, anxiety, hypervigilance, and an inability to trust their own judgment about other people. Elder Morrison found himself facing the most challenging crisis of his pastoral career. His congregation looked to him for spiritual guidance and comfort, but he struggled with his own faith crisis as he attempted to understand how such evil could have existed undetected in their community. His sermons during this period reflected his wrestling with questions about divine justice, human nature, and the problem of evil in a world supposedly governed by a benevolent God. The investigation into the Benders' escape revealed the sophistication of their planning and their knowledge of frontier survival techniques. They had cached supplies at strategic locations along their escape route, established false identities with forged documents, and demonstrated familiarity with remote trails that suggested extensive preparation for this eventuality. Colonel York realized that the family had been planning their escape almost from the moment they arrived in the settlement. Law enforcement agencies throughout the Western Territories were alerted to the Benders' flight, and wanted posters bearing their descriptions were distributed to every sheriff's office and marshal's station from Arizona to California. The reward offered for their capture was substantial enough to motivate professional bounty hunters and amateur trackers alike, but the family's head start and careful preparation made immediate capture unlikely. The territorial governor, responding to public outrage and pressure from influential families of the victims, authorized the formation of a special investigative unit dedicated to tracking down the fugitive family. This unit, led by experienced frontier lawmen and supported by federal resources, represented one of the most extensive manhunts in the territory's history. Meanwhile, the abandoned inn became a site of morbid fascination for visitors from throughout the region. Curiosity seekers, journalists, and law enforcement officials made pilgrimages to view the scene of the crimes, creating a macabre tourism industry that disturbed the local community. Elder Morrison and other community leaders eventually decided to burn the building to the ground, hoping to eliminate the physical reminder of their trauma and discourage continued intrusion by outsiders. The psychological impact on the settlement's children was particularly severe. Many had played around the inn, interacted with the Bender family, and even shared meals at the establishment where so many murders had occurred. Parents struggled to help their children process the reality that people they had trusted were capable of such horrific acts, while also protecting them from the full details of the crimes. As weeks passed without any credible sightings of the fugitive family, speculation about their fate began to replace hope for their capture. Some believed they had successfully reached California and assumed new identities, while others suggested they might have perished in the desert or fallen victim to hostile Native American tribes. A few community members expressed the dark hope that divine justice had already been served through their deaths in the wilderness. The Bender case became a cautionary tale that spread throughout the frontier territories, serving as a reminder that evil could hide behind facades of respectability and religious devotion. The story was retold in newspapers, dime novels, and campfire conversations, often with embellishments that made the truth even more horrifying than the documented facts. For the Mormon community that had unwittingly harbored the killers, the aftermath of the Bender revelations would require years of healing and rebuilding. The trauma of betrayal and the challenge of maintaining faith in human goodness after such a profound deception would test their spiritual resilience and community bonds in ways they had never imagined possible. The months following the Bender family's escape transformed the once peaceful Mormon settlement into a community haunted by memories and consumed by an obsession with justice that bordered on the unhealthy. Colonel York, despite his official duties calling him back to Kansas, remained in the territory for an extended period, driven by a personal need for closure that transcended his professional obligations. His brother's murder had become more than a case to solve. It represented a wound that could only heal through the capture and punishment of those responsible. The Colonel's continued investigation revealed disturbing evidence that the Benders' crimes extended far beyond the 11 bodies recovered from their property. Cross-referencing missing person reports from across the southwestern territories suggested that the family might have been operating for years before settling in the Mormon community, leaving a trail of victims that could number in the dozens. Reports began filtering in from other settlements about mysterious disappearances that followed patterns similar to those documented at the Bender Inn. A trading post in New Mexico reported the vanishing of several wealthy merchants who had been directed to a helpful family operating a roadside establishment. A mining camp in Colorado described the disappearance of prospectors carrying significant amounts of gold dust after they had been seen with individuals matching the Benders' descriptions. These revelations suggested that the family had developed their murderous enterprise over many years, perfecting their techniques and expanding their operations as they moved from location to location. Their decision to settle in the Mormon community may have represented the culmination of their criminal evolution rather than its beginning, explaining their sophisticated methods and psychological manipulation skills. The territorial authorities, recognizing the scope of the investigation, established a special commission to coordinate efforts across multiple jurisdictions. This commission, one of the first examples of interterritorial law enforcement cooperation, brought together experienced investigators, federal marshals, and local sheriffs in an unprecedented collaborative effort to track down the fugitive family. Meanwhile, the Mormon settlement struggled to rebuild its sense of security and community trust. The psychological trauma of discovering that they had harbored cannibalistic murderers created lasting changes in how residents interacted with strangers and each other. The community's traditional hospitality toward travelers became tempered with suspicion and caution that fundamentally altered its character. Elder Morrison implemented new protocols for vetting newcomers to the settlement, requiring references from previous communities and establishing probationary periods before full acceptance into the congregation. These measures, while practical, represented a departure from the open-hearted welcome that had previously characterized the community's approach to strangers seeking refuge or opportunity. The children of the settlement, perhaps most affected by the trauma, began displaying behavioral changes that concerned their parents and teachers. Many developed fears of strangers, nightmares about the Bender family, and an obsessive interest in the details of the crimes that was both unhealthy and difficult to address. Some families considered relocating to other communities to escape the psychological burden of remaining in a place so closely associated with horror. Dr. Martinez, whose medical practice had expanded to include treating the psychological effects of trauma, documented symptoms among community members that would later be recognized as characteristic of collective post-traumatic stress. His notes described persistent anxiety, hypervigilance, sleep disturbances, and an inability to trust personal judgment about other people's character, effects that would influence the community for generations. As the first anniversary of the Benders' escape approached, reported sightings of the family began to multiply across the Western Territories. Most of these reports proved to be cases of mistaken identity or wishful thinking, but each one generated renewed hope and investigative activity. The most promising lead came from a California mining town where a family matching the Benders' description had operated a boarding house for several months before disappearing again under suspicious circumstances. The California investigation revealed evidence that supported the theory of the family's survival and continued criminal activity. Local authorities found a hastily abandoned property with signs of recent occupation and evidence suggesting that the residents had departed suddenly upon learning of increased law enforcement attention. Personal effects discovered at the site included items that appeared to belong to missing travelers, continuing the pattern established at the Arizona Inn. However, the trail went cold in California, and subsequent investigations failed to produce credible evidence of the family's whereabouts. Some investigators theorized that they had crossed into Mexico, where extradition would be difficult and law enforcement cooperation limited. Others suggested they might have assumed completely new identities and integrated into established communities where their past would remain hidden. The lack of resolution began to take a psychological toll on those most invested in capturing the fugitives. Colonel York, whose initial determination had inspired the extensive manhunt, gradually showed signs of the obsession consuming his life. His health deteriorated, his professional responsibilities suffered, and his relationships with family and colleagues became strained by his single-minded focus on a case that seemed increasingly unlikely to reach a satisfactory conclusion. The broader public's fascination with the Bender case contributed to the development of a mythology that often obscured the factual details of their crimes. Dime novels and newspaper accounts embellished the story with sensational details that bore little resemblance to documented evidence, creating a legend that was more entertaining than accurate, but which served to keep public interest alive. Some accounts portrayed the family as supernatural entities rather than human criminals, suggesting that their ability to evade capture demonstrated otherworldly powers. Others focused on the cannibalistic aspects of their crimes to such an extent that the systematic nature of their predatory enterprise was overshadowed by sensational details designed to shock rather than inform. The Mormon community found itself reluctantly thrust into the spotlight as journalists and curiosity seekers continued to visit the site of the former inn. These intrusions disrupted the community's efforts to heal and move forward, creating ongoing trauma that complicated their recovery process. Community leaders eventually erected barriers around the inn's former location and posted guards to discourage trespassers. As years passed without resolution, the Bender case began to fade from active investigation to historical curiosity. New crimes and challenges demanded law enforcement attention, while the fugitive family either successfully maintained their concealment or had perished in circumstances that left no trace. The case remained officially open, but practical efforts to locate the perpetrators gradually diminished. The psychological legacy of the Bender crimes continued to influence the Mormon settlement long after the physical evidence had been removed and the immediate trauma had begun to heal. The community's approach to strangers, its internal security measures, and its collective memory were permanently altered by the experience of harboring such evil unknowingly. For the families of the victims, the lack of closure created ongoing anguish that time could not fully heal. Without the satisfaction of seeing justice served or understanding the full scope of their loved ones' suffering, they were left to struggle with questions that would never receive answers and grief that could never be fully resolved. The Bender case became a cautionary tale that influenced frontier communities throughout the American West, serving as a reminder that evil could wear the mask of respectability with terrifying effectiveness. The story's enduring power lay not just in its shocking details, but in its demonstration of how completely appearances could deceive and how vulnerable even close-knit communities could be to predators who understood the art of psychological manipulation.